There's a moment that happens in most people's financial lives that nobody talks about. It doesn't announce itself. There's no alarm, no notification, no dramatic turning point. It just quietly arrives. And when it does, everything changes. Not all at once, but slowly, in ways that compound over time. That moment is the day your income stops growing. And what begins on that day is something far more important than most people ever realize. Most people spend their entire working lives chasing a higher number on their paycheck. They believe, genuinely and deeply, that earning more is the answer to every financial problem they have. More income means more security. More income means more freedom. More income means a better life. And to be fair, that belief isn't entirely wrong. But it is dangerously incomplete. Because the real question was never just how much you earn. The real question is what happens when that earning stops climbing. Think about someone who has spent a decade building their career. They've gotten raises, maybe a promotion or two. Perhaps they switched jobs a few times to land a better salary. Every year, the number got a little bigger. And every year, so did the lifestyle that came with it. A slightly nicer apartment, a newer car, better restaurants, faster phones. It all felt like progress. And in some ways it was. But underneath all of that visible progress, something invisible was also happening. Their expenses were learning to keep pace with their income. Quietly, efficiently, almost automatically. This is the first thing that begins when income plateaus. The gap between what you earn and what you spend, which was never that wide to begin with, starts to feel even narrower. Because the lifestyle you built was designed around the expectation that income would keep going up. When it doesn't, the math changes. And most people don't notice until it's already done its damage. Here's the deeper truth about lifestyle and money that rarely gets discussed in straightforward terms. Spending habits are not just financial decisions. They are emotional ones. When your income was growing, every little upgrade felt like a reward you had earned. A natural expression of your progress. But once income levels off, those same habits don't quietly step back. They stay. They solidify. They become the baseline of what normal feels like to you. And that baseline is now fixed at a level your stagnant income was never fully prepared to sustain long term. This creates a quiet kind of financial pressure that most people misidentify. They don't think of it as a structural problem. They think of it as a temporary squeeze. They tell themselves things will get better next quarter, next year, once the economy shifts, once their boss finally notices them. But the months go by, and the pressure doesn't lift. Instead, it starts expressing itself in very specific and recognizable ways. Savings slow down. That's usually the first sign. Not because the person is spending irresponsibly by some dramatic definition, but because the margins were already thin. And thin margins have no cushion for anything unexpected. A car repair, a medical bill, a home appliance that decides to give out at the worst possible time. Each of these events, which are just ordinary parts of life, starts eating into whatever small reserves existed. And reserves that get eaten into but never fully rebuilt begin to disappear. Credit starts filling the gaps next. Not always in the form of reckless borrowing, but in the subtle, everyday ways that most people rationalize as reasonable. A little on the card this month because cash is tight. A short-term payment plan because it keeps the monthly number manageable. A deferred payment here, a rolled-over balance there. None of it feels catastrophic in isolation. But collectively, these small decisions are doing something very specific. They are borrowing from future income to fund present comfort. And that process, once it starts, has a momentum of its own. Now here is where the story gets more interesting. And more important. Because what's happening on the surface, the savings dropping, the credit rising, the financial pressure building, is actually the symptom. The real condition underneath is something else entirely. It's the absence of a second engine. When income grows steadily, it functions as the primary driver of financial momentum. The raise you get this year pays off what stretched you last year. The bonus covers what the budget couldn't. The promotion funds the next chapter. But when that engine idles, all of the weight that was resting on it becomes fully visible. And if there's nothing else generating financial motion, that weight starts pulling everything backward. This is why financial educators, across cultures and time periods, keep returning to the same principle. Not because it's a secret or a trick, but because it's one of the few things that actually changes the structural reality of someone's financial life. That principle is that income from effort and income from assets are fundamentally different in nature. One requires your presence, your time, your energy, and your continued participation. The other does not. Most working people rely almost entirely on the first kind. They trade time for money in a fair exchange. And for a long stretch of their careers, that exchange feels sustainable. But it has a ceiling. It has a plateau. And when you reach it, the absence of the second kind becomes impossible to ignore. The reason this matters so specifically at the plateau is timing. When income is growing, most people tell themselves they'll start building assets later. When things calm down. When there's more to work with. When the circumstances feel right. But income growth has a way of creating urgency for other things. A bigger home, a wedding, children, travel, lifestyle upgrades that were always the destination. The assets get deferred. The second engine never gets built. And then the plateau arrives, and there's nothing to activate. Understanding this is not about assigning blame or making anyone feel behind. It's about understanding a pattern so clearly that you can interrupt it. Because the plateau, as uncomfortable as it feels, is actually one of the most clarifying moments in a person's financial life. It is the moment where the strategy that worked in Chapter 1 of your career stops being sufficient, and Chapter 2 requires something genuinely different. What does something genuinely different look like? It starts with a mental shift that sounds simple but takes real work to actually internalize. The shift is this. Your income is not your wealth. Your income is a tool. And like any tool, what you build with it matters more than how sharp it is. Someone earning a moderate income who consistently directs a portion of it toward things that grow and compound over time will, in most realistic scenarios, arrive at a far stronger financial position than someone earning twice as much who channels everything into consumption and lifestyle maintenance. This isn't a theory. It's a pattern that plays out with remarkable consistency. The variable is not the income level. The variable is what gets done with the gap, however large or small, between what comes in and what goes out. And here's what makes the plateau so significant. When income was growing, that gap was expanding naturally, almost effortlessly. Once growth stops, the gap has to be created intentionally. It has to be chosen, protected, and directed with purpose. That's a different skill, and most people were never taught it. Let's talk about what intentional gap management actually means in practical terms, because abstract principles are only useful when they translate into real decisions. It starts with an honest look at where the money is actually going, not a general sense of it, but a clear-eyed accounting. Most people who do this for the first time are surprised, not by one dramatic category, but by the accumulation of many small ones. Subscriptions they forgot about. Habits that quietly became expensive over time. Convenience costs that solved a 10-minute problem but added up to thousands annually. Trimming these doesn't solve everything. It's not the whole answer. But it does something important. It reveals what was invisible before. And when you can see clearly, you can choose clearly. The goal is not to cut everything joyful out of your life in the name of financial discipline. The goal is to ensure that your spending is a genuine reflection of your values, and not simply the residue of old habits that formed during a time when income growth was doing the heavy lifting. Once the gap is made visible and intentional, the question becomes, where does that gap go? And this is where long-term thinking either enters the picture or it doesn't. Most financial mistakes aren't made in moments of carelessness. They're made in moments of short-term logic. The decision makes sense for right now. It solves today's problem. It feels reasonable in the context of this week or this month. But the long-term consequence of that decision is never fully factored in. Not because people are incapable of doing that math, but because the brain is wired to weight the present very heavily against the future. Building wealth during and after an income plateau is fundamentally an exercise in retraining that default. It's about regularly asking a question that doesn't come naturally. Not just what does this cost me today, but what does this choice cost me 10 years from now? And what does the alternative earn me instead? That question, applied consistently, changes everything. Not overnight. Not in a way that makes for exciting before and after stories in the short term, but in a way that compounds. And compounding, across a long enough timeline, is one of the most powerful forces available to an ordinary person with ordinary income. The person who understands this and begins early, even imperfectly, almost always ends up ahead of the person who waited for perfect conditions that never arrived. There is one more dimension to this conversation that doesn't get enough attention, and it has to do with identity. Because when income stops growing, something psychological happens alongside the financial shifts. People who tied their sense of progress and self-worth to the upward movement of their salary find that the plateau feels like stagnation, even if objectively nothing has gotten worse. The number isn't shrinking. The job is still there. But the feeling of forward momentum is gone. And in that feeling's absence, some people make decisions that are really emotional responses dressed up as financial ones. They overspend to recreate the feeling of abundance that growth used to provide. They take on financial risks they wouldn't normally consider because they're chasing the sensation of movement. Or they shut down entirely, telling themselves that the window has passed and there's no point in trying to build anything now. None of these responses are financially useful, but all of them are deeply human. Understanding why they happen is the first step to making sure they don't happen to you. The plateau is not the end of something. It is the beginning of a test. A test of whether the financial habits and mindset you develop during the growth years are capable of producing real results when the automatic tailwind of rising income is no longer there to carry you. Most people fail this test not because they lack intelligence or discipline, but because they were never clearly shown what the test was actually measuring. It is measuring whether you can separate your financial outcomes from your income level, whether you can build something lasting from what you already have, rather than perpetually waiting for more to arrive before you start. Whether you understand that wealth and income are related but not the same, and that the distance between the two is where your choices live. The people who pass this test don't do it by becoming extraordinary. They do it by becoming consistent. By deciding, often quietly and without fanfare, that they will not wait for a raise to start building. That they will work with the income they have, direct it with intention, protect the gap, and think in years rather than weeks. That decision, made and renewed repeatedly, is the actual turning point that most people are waiting to feel but never will unless they make it themselves. So if you are at a plateau right now, or approaching one, or reflecting on one that already passed, this is what matters most. The day your income stops growing is not the day your financial future is decided. It is the day your financial future becomes fully your responsibility. And that is not something to fear. It is something to understand, to accept, and to take seriously. If this video gave you a new way of thinking about your own financial situation, do one simple thing right now. Hit the like button. It takes a second, and it genuinely helps this content reach the people who need it most. If you have thoughts, questions, or a perspective from your own experience, drop it in the comments. Every conversation in that section adds something. And if you want more content built around long-term thinking and financial clarity, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. The goal of this channel has always been the same: to give you frameworks that actually hold up over time. And there's a lot more of that ahead.